Chapter I. The sea as a world, with medieval minds, and the ocean. To a person in the early medieval centuries, the sea was not a highway waiting to be mastered. It was something altogether more unsettling, a vast living boundary and the own world, and the known world, and the unknown place. The ordinary rules of the land did not apply, and where forces beyond human understanding held undisputed dominion. The ocean appeared in medieval Devra theology as a device of divine testing, of beauty, tool, and spiritual. And yet, despite this cultural ambivalence, medieval people, they went to sea in extraordinary numbers, pel substance, sun sustenance. The necessity. The medieval world inherited from ancient equity a complex of knowledge out the sea and how to navigate it. But it also at the fear of it. It heirs of it fears it fear of free works from fludges to lutens and the hours, its power, the Mediterranean body of water that had been the center of commercial and military life, remained a highway. You of highways a boy. Skes poi po fue mentes that poi up to administrative systems that had once eased its traffic. The northern seas, the Atlantic, the North, then Baltic. The Baltic, those Challenger, different technologies, different English technology, the different navigational strategies, and relationship between the sailor and the water beneath his hull. What made medieval sea voyaging remarkable wasn't technology, which wasn't any resembler the Romans had used at their height. Its geographic ambition between beach centuries, Mevals, sailors, Norse, Arab, Italian, Iberian, and many, and the boundaries push the boundaries of the known maritime world with a determination, MVQ and basin and bosun on earth. They did this without accurate charts of large portions without precise fermenting and without any feed and reliable weather forecasting existing system. forecasting system. They succeeded because of accumulated practicalized extemporaneous and a willingness to accept risks that our risk-averse age finds different. Comprehend. Chapter 2, Ships of Wind, Nen, Wind, Navigation. The ships. These across the world's oceans were products longest of practical aspern esfeminium, refined through generations of working knowledge from master shipwrights, says apprentice, von Franks, the captains to the sailors, to the sailandim, to the sailors who crewed under them. Medieval ship design was not static. It evolved with engineers, sailors, and shielders, builders, and encountered challenge and developed new solutions and variant. And the varieties that exists in this since thing is and is destroyed. This was extraordinary. In the Mediterranean world, the dominant vessel for cargo transport was roars the goats rode the round ship, a broad-beamed, deep-holed sail and beamed, deep-holed sailing vessel designed to maximize capacity. These vessels being to maneuver and maneuverability. These vessels were typically clicker-built. They could put zagoos in a box. In the Melit, in a Mediterranean style, largely in where the whole planks of large or let fly over rinse at her or met flush, a difference that affected both the structural character of the hall and the alley, the building techniques. Reek. Mediterranean round ships were typically rigged with lateen sails, triangular, four sail and avisen, sailing. During the early medieval period, and that gave considerable advantage when to England at angles to the wind. The clinkered built of northern Europe produced a very different kind of vessel. The Viking longship, the most hardest, was built for speed and flexibility. Cargo giving a hull of remarkable that could absorb the stresses as of heavy seas better than a more rigid carvel construction. The longship's shallow draft allotted between rigged and rigged to in big and Avergut and Ridderland and to navigate rivers far inland, capabilities, and a north style of raiding and an exploration. The same clinker building tradition. No slow. Du, nor, ner, nort. The Norse cargo vessel. The colonists and their supplies across Atlantis to then. Across the North Atlantic to Greenland, England. I Morthamir of North America. The rigging of medieval ships evolved significantly at the period. And of the voyages that became possible. The square sail, the dominant rig of Northern Europe during ships throughout of the medieval period. Drove vessel of Fifili was and subverting the directions from which a square rigger could make progress. The gradual adoption of the lateen sail in northern hemispheres and eventually the development of hybrid rigs combining and lateen sails on multiple masts gave medieval ships the ability to sail closer to the direction of the wind and make broader range of weather conditions. Steering technology was another area of criticalness. Erif of Figoport Rudirmirt, a large oar-mounted corn mount order. The starboard board, the steerboard, from which we derive the word starboard. This steering oar was rear oar. It was what could be overwhelmed in heavy weather. And in heavy weather, it required that the helmsman required at the stern the run of the vessel. The gradual adoption of the stern rudder with set service at the very stern of the vessel on and iron kant and unpitu and gudgeon's hinge thuringed. During the 12th, 13th centuries gave medieval ships a steering systems substantially greater effectiveness, particularly in larger vessels and in rough conditions. Chapter 3, Reading the Sea, Navigation without instruments. Medieval navigation, Muse was a ordinary sophistication and certes, but something from a modern perspective, almost possibly primitive. A medieval ship's pilot navigating across open water without GPS without GPS, without accurate charts, without a reliable compass, and without a reliable compass in the relays, annulling as longitude was doing something that demands our genuine admiration and understanding how we did it reveals worlds of engines as complex and as carefully developed any modern technical. The most fundamental legational skills, the mythical was the natural world around him, wind around him, wind patterns, swell directions, cloud formations, the coloration of the water, and temperature of the water, the behavior of birds and marine animals, the smell of the air, all of these provided information to the experienced navigator who had learned through years of practice how to interpret them. Norse sailors said they know that donkey knew valormation, cloud, land below the loon, knew. They knew that the behavior of migrating birds at deadbacks and knew of land. They knew the seasonal patterns, the Atlantic swells, and how to use them as a directional reference, as in the sun and visions. The sun and stars were invisible, the magnetic compass. Which were a word of navigation before the compass, maintaining a Earth's a navigator who lost sight of the sun and stars for several days had no reliable way of determining which direction he was heading. The compass did not immediately transform its form navigation. Early compasses were imprecise, and their users often had a limited understanding of magnetic variation. But it provided a direct directional reference that remained available regardless of weather condition, fundamentally bluest. What was possible in terms of all-weather latitude, the north-south position of the nude, relative to the equator, could estimate it of the ethum nude, or the sim of the sun at noon, or the horizon, the kamal, a simple device. The Amyot Arab navigators in the Indian, in the the ocean, you're the bad and the sailor. Allowing a sailor to estimate his latitude with good accuracy. Longitude, however, the east-west piston, essentially without an without an deviation. At an accurate time, keeping device synchronized to a known reference point. There was no way to determine how far east or west had traveled. Medieval navigators managed this in an ending dead reckoning definition and direction and elapsed time m from a known starting point. Neek, that required the quant and circumums to execute well. The portal and chart, the pre-navigation chart, then of Threll Bringled 333. Rishta. Then the navigators. To the medieval navigators, unlike the map, a mundane portent to and according chorological to call and collegial the shats. Portal and charts were working documents drawn the accumulated practical experience of numerines sailors. They showed coastlines in maze plagues and hazard warnings and cuffs allings covered web as a web with a web of Coventry bin Queens Black and spread through the Ruth ports retrained ports. The Portland tradition spread Mediterranean through the Mediterranean as and the charts posted who used by Newcastle. In the charts produced by Tagian, Genesian Moose of East and Cardan and Tad out of East and Bernician Cartiers in Ephrophers here then in the 14th and 15th centuries and even Garcidanes. Of the Me World. Chapter Havi. The Norse voyagers. Longships and the edge of the world between the late 8th and Unread and Unrichened and navigators. Scandinavia accomplished something unprecedented in human history. They extended the reach of European civilizations of Vasabib, the northeast, Breath, the north of the North Sand and Southing Southland and Greenland, and making landfall on the coast of North America. before Columbus. This achievement rested on a combination of exceptional shipbuilding, practice, attitude, food, fashion, family of these medieval peoples. The Norse relationship had North mythology found then stand. The sea was simultaneously as Hari connected by the two communities to one another and to the wider world, and the arena which Gilya Mia Mustrolivers prestige were won and demonstrated. Norse mythology, Goismythologies, the sea. At the sea, the great worldland, Cheromonger encircled the known world in the depths, and the afterlife of the warrior was sometimes conceived as a voyage across water. This cultural saturation of maritime meaning means approached the sea. As a fund element, a lone world of their world. The Norse expansion into the North Atlantic did not begin to settle in, which appears to have had no success. Though some evidence suggests as earlier Irish monks may have proven the Norse. But the Norse arrival, Iceland offered agricultural land, and of it Isherhedrit and ease that made it Eastbilst and Bration. Exploration. The North settlement of Iceland was substantial. By the time this other of Circense and the island had relations and those. And created a permanent Norse presence in the North Atlantic that would sustain further exploration. For generations, the settlement of Greenland, initiated by Erik owing his banishment following Raismund from Iceland around 9 CE to 85 CE, and with 95 CDD extended the Norse presence even further into the North Atlantic and established communities that would persist several centuries before ultimate period. Erik's promotional description of the new land as Greenland, a name that's given at Duratori's actual climate, was a deliberate piece of marketing designed to attract Borıng Icelandic sagas that record his story. The Greenlandic settlements, their peak population of Fafsta of Hafsensenden, and maintains a new slingy, a new through regular shipping, the Norse discovery of North America, the land they called Vinland. Vinland is described in two Icelandic sagas. The two Icelandic, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, which record the voyages of Leif Erikson and other Norse of Newfoundland to lands west of Greenland. Archaeological confirmation of a Norse presence came into the 1960s, came in discoveries of the disk of Midor's Abyss, Saints and Ornifrade, where Newfoundland, where revealed the remains of Norse buildings constructed in the early 11th CE. The site appears to have been occupied briefly, perhaps for only a few years, before the Norse, the Segas with Thumpunkt with the inhabitants and inhabitants made permanent settlement and unviable. Chapter V, a Mediterranean world. Arab, Byzantine, and Italian sailors, while the Norse were pushing the bounds of the North Atlantic. The Mediterranean, the main Termanian, emptying in the made into trafficked in the medieval world. The sea that had been at the center of Roman commerce, and the Palms Fall. At Rome's fall, it remained a highway connecting the civilizations of Europe, the Southern, the Middle East, and North Africa, though the political Kolakregwinwig, the Yerks, organized its traffic, were transformed beyond recognition from their ancient form. Arab sailors and merchants were among Mediterranean, following the Arab conquests. The seventh League, North Africa, and eventually the Ispli commerciality Arab commercial networks expanded dramatically across Indian Ocean. Arab geographers and navigators developed sophisticacies, both sea basins, and the Tao of the Umar of the Arab maritime tradition, built with planks sewn together with cotton tether, fiber, and linen, and rigged with a lateen sail, proved room well adapted to the conditions of Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean monsoon. Byzantine sailors maintained the maritime traditions. The Mormon world, the the medieval period, Constantinople's Bosphorus, the Bosporus, Cross, pressing, tween Black Sea and Jean, Gain gave a Bincy, Izen in Ironpen, a Bezerti, and Treen the Teograd of Dreadiv Braniun, and the Trill Prade, between the Mediterranean world and the grain, wool, and fur producing regions, regions of the northern steppe. Byzantine warships, the fast dreams, and used weapon Greer, used an incendiary weapon called Greek fire, a substance that burned on water, and could not be extinguished by conventional means, giving Byzantine Nazatel a tactical advantage that helped them defend the empire's maritime interests. The Italian city-states Venors Murphy emerged in 11th centuries as the dominant commercial maritime of the Western Mediterranean, and their influence extended to that sea. Moon. Of that sea, Venice's position at the head of the edit. Hip-ended and unparalleled. Gave it unparalleled as to the luxury goods of the Eastern trade. Venetian galleys, long, oared vessels capable of maintaining schedule regardless of wind conditions. He preferred carrying the claimed carriers of high value cargo across the Mediterranean, and the Venetian state invested heavily in the infrastructure of maritime commerce. The arsenal, one of the largest industrial facilities in the medieval world, could produce efficiency. The Crusades, beginning with the first crusade of 1096 in 1096 and 1096. In various forms through the 3rd century and beyond, created an enormous demand for maritime transport, all in cities to supply, moving an army of along their with their horses and on sets prow highs, across the Mediterranean, across the Messetes, prior Quarterang, early Meritomandarising, and been seen since the Roman Empire. The Crusades made the fortunes, and Genoese gave Italian sailors. Its sailors, these Greeks, and Nuris Harrier Italians and Dakars. And Larskin operation and opened new commercial connections between and Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean that would permit for centuries. Chapter the A. The Hanseatic League, masters of the northern seas. In the northern seas of medieval Europe, the Baltic, the North Sea, the Baltic, the North Sea, and the waters connecting them through the Danish Straits. A commercial maritime network emerged during the network merged to Mutsup net wealth and full lifts and 13th centuries that would eventually become one of the most panomic or medieval. In medieval history, the Hanseatic League, the association of Nordeutern German Strent Nori Street, send it prepped 9th century to the 17th, built its power on the movement of bulk commodities across the northern seas in a manner in face of every coastal it touched. The Hanse's commercial empire was built on a foundation of simple but essential goods. Herring, caught in the waters of the Baltic, was salt, and sportins, and exported across Europe, providing the protein bupalines inland tune. Grain, the long Lenten fasting season, grain from the agricultural plains of Poland and moved westward through Dwanzi and Luce to the grain cities of the Netherlands and Pimbered, Amber naval stores, tar, hemp from the forests above the Wangit of the Atlantic coast, furs from the forests of Russia and Scandinavia, moved southward toward the luxury markets of Paris and Florence. The Hanse's cocks, the cogs, the broad-beamed, halide sailing vessels that were the workhorse of northern medieval commerce, moved droves, and the Hugus was in this trade remarkable efficiency. The cog was in many respects a defining ship of northern commerce, broad, deep, and deep with flat-bottomed. It was designed for maximum capacity rather than speed, and its high freeboard. That's how between the waterline and the top of the hull, made it difficult to board in the event of piratical attack and the rough conditions of the North Sea and the Baltic. The cog's single square sail, that uncentered, of freshly in the previous sailing winds, stems and stem, and its straight stems they served her Viking. Very different from the curved Viking hull forms. Reflected a different philosophy of ship construction, adapted to different commercial requirements. The Hanseatic commercial simmed an entire infrastructure, warehouses and financial instruments. Handsome merchants established permanent trading train tours, contour in the majors of their commercial network. The steelyard in London, the Fondo dei Tedeschi in Bergen. These establishments secured paid accommodations, storage service, and some merchants operating far from their home cities, the Howsam cities, and the home cities. They also serve for gathering commercial intelligence and maintaining lists that were essential for commercial survival in the medieval world. The commercial power of the Hanseatic League, the Et Equales, lended this amicably with Skaintoll. Tendi and Leo Millihem. Gauge military force. The League waged wars against the Danish crown, which sought to control the two vital straits between the Mersey and the Bartha Sea, and against the and Ocean privileges. The League's naval forces assembled from vessels of member cities, members of these arms campaigns were not standing navies in the modern sense, but they could be mobilized effectively when the League's commercial interests threatened chapter of Saf's wrecks and the reality of danger. Medieval sea voyaging was genuinely dangerous in ways that even experienced sailors could not always mitigate. The ships of the medieval were small by modern standards. Their hulls or meters, or seamen meters or more in deep severes. Atlantic storms, their navigation was imprecise enough that a sustained period of weather enveloped them in their position by a Gemev, millimeters, by a Negroes, many kilometers. Their weather for a period it tended barely beyond the immediate sky, yet sky was that the north sky that soon the bay of develop with a speed. The speed gave little warning. Shipwreck was Sims in the maritime world. Sofa from Merrill. That it shaped the vocal of political frameworks and frameworks through the sea. With the sea, medieval chronicle of ships lost in storms, armed arms, entire fleets destroyed by sudden tempests. Sudden shores the shore are mentioned to. Clinging to wreckage. The archaeological record confirms the literary evidence. Ends. That the Melrosy Liverians, the Melturbanians, and the Northern Sea, the littered the remains of Menegals, of Menfus, of Farzov, of Vipasals, their cargoes, ovals, of amphorae, millenniums, illstones in its stones, in its personal possessions preserved by the cold of the stew-warmer of the deep. The most dangerous moments of any medieval voyage, and the approach to and departure from ONC passages, the Asalungung, though uncomfortable and potentially terrifying, were at least free from the hazard of shallow water and roll winds. And rocky coastlines, it was near shore. A ship driven by an Kanatmanju wind had made got cut to the rocks. Oh, the most, but that the most occurred, the wrecking of ships on rocky coasts, road soaps, more if you circle and it's. communities were often accused of luring ships onto rocks with base plum lights. Cargo, medieval law and ecclesial. 16. Suggests its perceived immorality. Immorality. Pirates were a persistent feature of the maritime life and the life, and the distinction between piracy and temenas wansen. In the Nerdorls, the mute and the mobbery. The modern world. The sea offered opportunities for armed robbery that stirs us. And identifiable rares made different to suppress Mediterranean corsairs in North Africa, various coastal strongholds, commercial and shell shipping, medieval period, Norse raiders whose activities in the 8th and 9th gave centuries is the word the Vikings, its modern connotations are connotated of maritime divisions, of maritime violence, were themselves a form of organized maritime predation, that was in some context indistinguishable from the raiding practices of other medieval maritime peoples. Disease, another major source of mortality on medieval ships. The crowded, damp contents of a medieval vessel with sails slipsing inches with minimal ventilation, eating often contaminated by vermin, and drinking water that deteriorated rapidly in wooden barrels. Prided than ideal visions for the transmission of infectious scurvy caused by vitamin C deficiency. Buttermilk was a vitamin C long hazard that lacked access to fresh fruit. Though evil sailors, heard sailors, said only empirical auras. The medieval literature of maritime disaster frequently attributes deaths, mass sea to disease rather than storm, and the accounts of ships arriving in port with a wrestling that the use and emnus espestenus, that this suggests that this is a far more common cause of memoirs of medics and in storm losses that tended to attract more literary. Chapter of The sailor's life. Diet and daily existence at sea. The daily life of a medieval sailor was shaped eagers of the sea missile. At sea, the constant motion of the vessel, the chronic dampness that permeated everything. 3. Good thing, restricted diet imposed by limited capacity. Human as musens emen, who had lived who had little choice but to share a small's Hong Kong's voice. Understanding what life was actually like with what was a student of skiveries to reveries, sips for your ordinary days at sea. At sea, a medieval cargo ship might carry a crew of between 12 and the Anan, the Benimen, the Ven, and then the natives of the Asaka, Comes. Command was exercised by the master, the captain, who was responsible for both the navigation and the commercialization of the voyage. Below the master was a hierarchy of ballast. The pilot, who primary responsibility for a coastal nation in coastal waters. Boats. The boatswain, who managed the rig and the rigging and the deck crew, and various petty oars and spurious spissers, specific responsibilities. The ordinary sailors, the forecastle crew, performed the labor of working the ship under the direction of theses, and their skills ranged from the base group work, hauling required of any crew member to the specialized knowledge nailmaker of the seer, the carpenter, and the caulker, whose skills kept us functioning. Food on medieval ship was a monotonous and an unpleasant affair by necessity. The primary staples of the medieval sailor's diet: a hard, dry bread, virtually all moisture, which vented spoilage for months. It had then been scented and stunty, steam weevils, salt fish or salt meat, dried legumes, and a refreshed food, and whatever fresh food could be acquired. Fresh water was carried in barrels and deteriorated rapidly. And an increasing unpleasant tin as a voyage lengthened. Wine or beer or carried partly because its alcohol content, and it became a problem of keeping the king thinking. Longer voyages. The inadequacy of this diet for maintaining health. Extended voyages was recognized in Medes by medieval sailors. Medieval were fresh fruit, vegetables, and protein whenever they made port. Sleep on a medieval ship. One knows an improvised affair. On small vessels, the crew creeped on the pumping deck when weather permitted. Have rough woolen blankets and blankets. On larger ships, there might be a small enclosure. The bow that gave its name to the crew's quarters. Providing some protection from the elements, but the space was cramped and offered little privacy. Watches divided the day. And rest. That at any given time, roughly half the crew was asleep while the other half worked the ship. This rotation meant that it was never complete or interrupted, and the chronic medieval of a sailor of the Rios Allelas, Relil, conformance, for judgment and performance. The social world of the medieval ship was governed by a mixture of formal authority. I'm all formal hierarchies is that develop in any small communities under stress. The master's word was laud medieval maritime law codes, such as the laws of Iran, which circulated throughout clarity, established the captain's authority, chloride specific penalties, for disobedience, but the captain who ruled too harshly or series too capriciously risked losing the risks of his crew, and when therefore this required the bonds of mutual dependence created among crews produced a distinctive social culture. Suspicious of outsiders, intensely loyal to shipmates, typically assumes, almost about survival, chapter higher, and see religion ritual, and the sacred ocean, medieval sailors lived as lived and with a warning and their religion, elation, and the sea voyage was understood in medieval culture as a spiritual illness, only a passage through a space through was it needed, was attenuated, and where God's will was expressed direct through wind and wave without human intermediation. The rituals that accompanied the departure of a medieval ship from port were seriously as vain pretensions against dangers as a priest would bless this a vessel, it says, before departure, invoking divine protection for the voyage. The crew would pray kukui, commentaries, and the ship to the care of the area of the Runathane and unvoiled maritime patronage. Saint Denis of Myra, most was venerated patron of sailors in the Latin West. It is in the West one of the subject is one of the most popular literatures and medieval hagiographic literature, and his image literature. And his image was carved ships, painted in the book prayers, and prayers across the entire range. Patron saints of the sea were not a purely abstract. Many medieval port towns maintained pipils dedicated to maritime saints, athering saints that served for sailors before departure, and as destinations for Thanksgiving arrival. The votive offerings deposited in these chapels, the minted panels dictated miraculous deliverances from shipwreck, written testimonies of divine created physical archives of the maritime community's relationship with the sacred. Some of these votive traditions survive to the present day in Mediterranean churches. Betuves, creditors, have stated gratitude for very spaders, dangers. St. Elmo's fire. The electrifiers sailed sails, ups, and spars, turns, thunderstorms, producing a bluish white glow. Woe was interpreted I mevo seems of divine presence, named for Saint and Eosmer, and he and early Christians of Alors the Mes, the patron of sailors in the Mediterranean tradition, Usun Ilmos, misfire was understood as the saint's visible manifestation in the rigging. In installation in the rigging, his presence a reassurance that God had not abandoned the ship in its extremity. This interpretation transformed a frightening natural phenomenon into a source of comfort. Example, medieval religious culture positive. The terrifying into the me to the me hatred of the sacred, the experience of religious crisis, the moment, faint, certain death. Sailors made as that sailed in heaven is documented in numerous medieval sources with consistency. Sailors pledged specific shrines is donations rated of CMH peril. When the danger passed, the keeping of these vows was taken seriously enough that medieval law recognized the binding character of sea vows. Ecclesiastical authorities dealt regularly with the petitions of sailors from release from vows they had made, and found. A noun found difficult to keep. This pattern of crisis, Baumakus, Vaugil, the genuine spirits iritas, reveals the sublime spirit with which medieval approached the sea, and the degree to which their religious life by their particular demands of a maritime existence. Chapter X. And in the Indian Ocean, the monsoon world, while European medieval sailing, the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean, the Almbitics of the Mediterranean, a parallel maritime world, extra-time world of adventures were created across the Indian Ocean. Arab Arist and Sungan sailors had been working driven sealing unseen for more the millennium before, and the Nivopum Neti and the period, and the commercial network they maintained connected the ports of the Arabian Peninsula, the East Coast Africa, the the west coast of India, and eventually skirm sitsi, the deficiency, the monsoon wind system of the Indostem of the Indian Ocean, and was both the foundation and the nourishing parenting supports among them threat and the support. The monsoons blow from the southwest across the Indian Ocean up some May to September, and from the north from to February. This predictable reversal of wind direction created in a time calendar Sadr could depart from Arabia or the Persia or in the November in the noon on Saturday. Each India or East Africa read I ferry read trade during the Piriber and Reenven and Rian to London and return on the southwest monsoon from June onward. This in the Winsims the timing of market festivals, the scheduling of credit instruments, and the solstice of portum literal societies, the Tao for a range of vessel types use Arab in Aratam in the condition of Indian Ocean sailing, the characteristic construction and technique of the dhow, quartzed with cords of filled the aragon nails. With an iron nail, the nails had similar to that it stresses, but it cordis that could absorb the stresses of monsoon seas, say better than a more rigid as fastened vessel. The Latin sail aus kite us kired, wheat house been resorians often required. Arab navigators developed sophisticated knowledge of Indians and errand orient symptoms over centuries, and their expertise has accorded in navigational manuals such as the Kitab al-Fawait Fadres, the Kilium al-Falawid, the Ubal-Bam Usali Wam al-Bara Walkawai, written by Ibn Majid in the 5th century, which compiled the accumulated navigational wisdom of the Arab seafaring tradition. The East Arab coast was the most impediments of the Median Ocean, a commercial system, a string of Swahili states, Kilwa, Malindi, Malinda Falala flourished from the ninth century, connecting to the interior of Africa with the maritime time trade of the Indian Ocean. These cities exported gold from the interior plateau of Zimbabwe, ivory, and of Emerita, Arabia, and India, and imported ceramics, textiles, and other manufactured goods in return. The Great Mosque of Tilwa, Dunya, in twins between Anitaries. Must the largest Africa mosque be to the wealth that Indian commerce and immersed forests generated for the cities that controlled it. The Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, the intermittent in the Insang recent Minister of Freed Setier from Lincoln Dennis onward, Chinese Eid Mamies Lunas and thence answers in the ports of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean through the medieval period, when Zhang Pitzenga and East Africa in Stonethorther in the 1430s. Its reception was organized around pre-existing commercial relationships and cultural contacts. Yet, captures cruises. The Kawamas had been building for centuries, the Crusades, and the great naval transports, the military expeditions that yet European Christendom then launched, laud the Holy Land, from Hendon 96 onward, created the largest demand for maritime transport the medieval Mediterranean had ever seen. Gun, satisfying that demand required a degree of commercial harmonization permanently transformed the maritime capabilities of the Italian city-states. Moving armies of crusaders, some numbering in the tens of thousands, together with their arms, provisions, administrative infrastructure of a military campaign required maritime resources that dwarfed any previous commercial operation. The First Crusade, which departed overland in 96 and Constantinople, and then the Levant by a combination of land and sea routes established the pattern for subsequent expeditions, but did not yet fully develop the maritime to crusading logistics. It was the Third Crusade of 1589 Vigaman A9 on Gun 92 on 92 on Andian involving the fleets of the English, French, and German kings alongside the Italian maritime forces of the Italian maritime cities. That demonstrates clearly and most clearly what organized maritime power could if you campaign. Richard I of England assembled all of the Hatfields and Flinten and Sieger at the Aziga siege in a demonstration of maritistics, the unprecedented, the beast, but it in the medieval West, the Fourth Crusade of 12 Flodred, 2 or 2 4 boosted. To maritime crusade to crusade leaders to tracted and us to provide troops for me, a army, agreeing to a price of the thousands of food for the fugitives. The other remarks, for the passage, there's 3,000 redend, 500 men, and their equipment, when the assembled army proved significantly smaller than endless Tat Sagun and Venetian under their aged but formidably Capo Doge and Rico Dandolo redirected the crusade to serve Venetian commercial interests, ultimately resulting in the sack of Constantinople in 204, or the establishment of a Latin empire in the Byzantine heartland. The episode illustrates how completely the logistics of maritime inhabitability mistaking bad in medieval mirror empires. Enterprise, the transport of crusading created a Mancuian infirmant rank but capable of paving full, the capable of carrying horses of as well as mills and the development of specialized transport ships. The Turides and Osiers of the Meres of the Mediterranean crusading period. What was a direct response to this need? Loading a horse onto a medieval ship was a significant technical challenge. The animal is slung in a harness and lowered into a special hold. Through a port in the stern, and Nestor is healthy and manageable during a sea passage of oars required considerable expertise. The logistical records aureas of various crusading editions document complexities, legitities of this operation, and considerable detail. During transit and the various strategies implements. Losses. The Italian city-states of crusade extended at beyond contracts. The Crusades opened permanent commercial contact between Western European merchants and the markets of the Eastern Mediterranean. The trading posts, orsts or fondaci, that Venetian and merchant and Genoese merchants established in the Crusader states, the Levant, for a trading network that connected the luxury goods of Asia to the consumer markets of Europe. This connection, maintained through the Merit-to-Merit-saying networks the crusading enterprise had created, and that subbed fear of the credulity. Virtually drive a lot period. Chapter her charts, compass, compasses, and the emergent centuries of teeth. Navigation. The 13th century was a pivotal moment in the navigation. It's two within which the thirds. To the problem of finding one's way at sea began to converge in ways would eventually the navigational of the early modern. The tools and methods that emerged during this made into a precise science, but they represented a qualitative shift in what was possible and in how sailors thought about of ocean navigation. The magnetic compass, though known, the late Philip Abridge was not immediate especially, and accounts of its use suggest considerable uncertainty of how to its readings. The phenomenon of magnetic declination, the fact that the magnetic compass doesn't true north to magnetic north Lunskinias and changes time or time was poorly understood and condustood most builded and others too and distributed contributed to navigational errors. Nevertheless, the compass and provided us in for a friend and a friend H a directional reference that provides of Madal regardless of the visibility of celestial beings and more feasible, the Portland chart to Portland wind emerged from the Mediterranean during the 18th century in a form that was superstited for its period. The earliest surviving Portland chart dating to Abapasos in approximately to Tuhon 1775. The Mediterranean shows the Mediterranean and remains remains impressive today. Today, with the characteristic network of run lanes, the verge of radiate lines radiating from central points that allowed a navigator off compass courses in any two ports in the chart. The method by which the early Portland chart makers Treithen Stun free leaner stay and but how it systematized the systematic accumulation of compass bearings bearings and distance estimates from generations of practical navigators whose local knowledge wedged into a coherent cartographic whole. The astrolabe brilliantly accomplishes a strong plumgal instrument developed classical world and resramined by whittled was for than was during the later medieval period, the mariner's astrolabe, a symptom of Piscean and desired altitude of the sun's thumb, despite the thumb a ship at sea. A latitude to determine their latitude with reasonable accuracy. Perseus, providing a felt of saluting in which reckoning on which navigators had previously relied. The development of printed navigational agains Dutch and matering it throughout the year, the mariner's combined with the mariner's astrolabe made latitude sailing maintaining a constant latitude while crossing an ocean, a practical technique that would be followed, that would be early oceanic voyages. The compilation of Valian in Alars rulers, Virtus in French, Portolani in Italian, Repelloniant, another intonted numeral in the Sibyllum in the ambitert. Period. These texts gathered practical advice, bedets, the depths of Warriors of Flang. The landmarks that identified specific headlings, tidal patterns of specific passages. In specific passages, they were essentially collective practical, noting the excuse of verse is formed the spirit yet not yet in sub, a word yet, made relevant passages themselves. The existence of gaze, grants ending phrase N, the merchant community and educational knowledge and navigational knowledge for a form of commercially valuable intellectual property worth recording and protecting. Chapter there harbors the cities of the sea, the port city, the means produced by medieval maritime civilization. A hybrid space where the rhythms, and requirements of the sea imposed themselves on the organization of the urbanization of life in ways differentiated maritime cities from their inland counterparts in culture, structure. To understand medieval CID is essential to it essential to assured the which they burned, the inference they returned, the infrastructure they maintained, and the social world that developed and water, the physical infrastructure of a medieval port required gent investment and maintenance, harbor walls or moles to perform surge, adequate gent of water for the vessels using the port. Thus lupo, with filling in unlike rugru and ruse for goods in transit. All of these required resources and only horses could afford, or strong territorial states could consistently. The great medieval ports, Venice, the Constantinople, Constantinopla, Lu, with Pierre Plovinoa, the Robsbury Plague, Albia, Alex of Rule, the Respublica Pumbria established themselves partly by the quality and capacity of their physical infrastructure, which gave them competitive advantages over smaller rivals. The medieval seaport was a place extraordinary ethnic, linguistic diversity. Ships arrived carrying in from across the known world, from the Mediterranean to Israel, housed communities of foreign merchants who maintained their own languages, legal systems, religious institutions, and within the host city, the Venetian Concorder of Constantinople, the Genoese of Genoa, the Genoese quarter off on the Black Sea of the Italian Greece, and the Italian cities in Alexandria, and in in German Kantor, or in Bergen. All were examples of this pattern of commercial diaspora in merchant formal communities. Formal privileges from host authorities that allowed them to operate with a degree, with cultural life within a fee. City, the loading and unloading of unmoored ships, the loading in the 80s, medieval or medieval port, and did generate occupational community, stevedores, dockhands, porters, crane operators were the muscle of the medieval port economy, and their casual labor was organized through a variety of guilds and the guild, the great cranes visible in medieval port paintings, mechanical represent some of the most veneering achievements of the medieval period in their carried in airs. The harbor cranes, preserveries of Bruges and in other northern European cities. Physical sense of the scale of medieval cargo handling operating. The taverns, inns, and clubs that clustered in neighborhood served a population and characteristics. Sailors between voyage required accommodation, food, drink, soon. Ships required Precaulian rope of cloth, rope, timber, and countless consumables of maritime operation. and merchants, and required secure warehouse space, access to credit, and the commercial intelligence networks that told them prices were favorable and were cargoes. The waterfront district of a major medieval was consulatal since and the Celestial and Slienthly's environment. The Mixley environment. The mixing point, many cultures. The locale of commercial transactions of vamius and vescale, and in individual violence, the most petty kind, simultaneously a place of extraordinary economic vitality. Engine, Signal Danger, Chapter Carve, Trade Goods, and the Economics of Medieval Maritime Commerce. Medieval maritimers, not a biography. Spices, of the spices. Then folklorical narrative. An important component, the economics of medieval metalment were dominated by a movement of heavy cumulates, bought a piece, value relative to their weight, made land transport impractical, abrasive, expensive. Understanding what medieval ships actually carried in terms of volume and commercial value reveals a maritime world. Eulo's Americ logic was stay, brise, or structured trash. Transportation. Grain was perhaps the single most important commodity in medieval commerce. Though it rarely XX Lorenzen and silk, the mismatch between grain was produced and where it was where it was consumed and undefended, we warmed the value on the medieval world. Of the medieval world, and the sea provided the only practicable means of moving grain in the quantities required large distances, as indeed. This supplied grain for Levan's ports in parts of Mediterranean Europe. The Baltic grain trade, organized by Hansa merchants, sailed on the Baltic of England. Maritime grain trade, the urge urban populations in the medieval Mediterranean, Northern Europe, Northern Europe could not have been fed. Salt was in movie, in whose the movement medieval maritime commerce in ways is, quote, in retrospect, salt was essential for the preservations and the precious and the world in a world out refrigeration and the demand for salt convisa risk wag spread the great salt works of Bay on the Atlantic coasts of France and the Surans and the salt pans of various Mediterranean locales, purgations produced far more salt than their surrounding regions could consume, and that surplus to the fish processing regions and one of the primary economic of medieval maritime trade. Wool, Ard and Claudius Ingolfield. In the trade, time trade, English from the sheepwalks of the Yorkshire Dales, Kelds and Keldswolds, and Durrell wool production was the moats of for the is destined city of the landers, and it's extollated one the create a node of it created most valuable in medieval Europe. The finished cloth that Flemish and Italian weavers produced from English wool was in turn exported and turned Yenmenti, indeed, the Eton and Dispriaki and the distribution chain. The geography of medieval maritime commerce was fundamentally traced by this wool cloth south and it involved in it Southampton, Bruges, Brewer derived enormous importance from their roles in Lloyd in this trade. The spice trade, for all that tends to dental accounts, ons, Astor's ants, somewhat limited nicked the overall of medieval mercaners. Maritime commerce, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. So the spices of South and Southeast, South and South are they via the Red Sea, Valder, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf trade routes organized by Arab and Indian merchants passed through Antioch of Alexandria, Beirut, and Route Edinburgh, reached consumer markets of Europe through commercial networks of the Italian states. The profits generated by his beach where this launch chain were real and sometimes enormous, but in wool, but a tonic in woolen train salt and salt. Salt and wool. What made spice economically significant? Its volume, but its density. The extraordinary ratio. The extraordinary radar ratio. The route that profitable to transport across thousands of kilometers of sea. Chapter Save the Portuguese and the Edge of the Medieval World. By the early 15th century, European sailors, Vikings, had quit myriad centuries and to ends and the bars the earth and the Vathy and the Baltic and venture into the Faroe Islands and the Azores. The systematic exploration of the caution of some Zurich and navigators and navigators onward from the resin Kent Retting 20s onward represents the culmination of medieval maritime tradition and simultaneously open new chapter world history. Hıstory. Understanding what the Portuguese accomplished. Reports scanning wires what they inherited from the medieval maritime world and what they added to it. The Portuguese advantage in Atlantic exploration rests in several foundations. Since the country's geographic position at the southwestern corner of Europe, Atrala to the Europe and the Atlantic. To the Atlantic include Atlantic. In sun systems of the eastern Atlantic, including the trade winds, blow trade windy consistently from the northeast in the tropical, and that would prove essential for outward voyages toward and the Americas. The Portuguese fishing commercial fleet had developed extensive experience in the Atlantic waters. Began, and the Portuguese crown under sons and Turian, known to later historians as the navigator, provided the support and sustained financial commit that made this exploration the African coast possible. The caravel, the vessel most closely with Brewation, definite More practical, the caravel was a relatively small, shallow draft vessel, typically rigged with lateen sailed to the wind. Close to the wind, this windward ability the explorated the leeward of the African coast. The prevailing winds and currents made a return voyage northward potentially very difficult, that could not sail effective the wind. The wind, the caravel's combination of seakeeping ability, mobility, and overload. A load carry capacity made it ideal exploration for to the conditions of the eastern Atlantic. The systematic Portuguese proceeded gradually southward over the course of the 15th century, each extending the known coastline a little further. Currents and winds, currents, and both voyages, both safer.
And
the rounding of Cape Bojador in between 34 and Ahentian 34, headland on the West African coast, coasts that had acquired a cyclical significance as the edge of the navigable world in the amoebal world in the imagination of European sailors, was a landmark moment, but it was followed by decades of further exploration before the Portuguese reached the Gulf of Guinea, rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1888. It opened to India. Vasco da Gama completed in an Vasco da Gama 9490 and 17 and range 97 and 17 and 49 and 89 and 99. The achievement of the Portuguese gators stands as the antithesis of the medieval and early modern worlds. They worked then within a medieval technological ships and their navigational methods and their commercial organization were all products mediated and mediated. But they pushed framework beyond its previous limits in ways changed the world. The direct Suez connection between Europe and they established the Silk Route, Eurasian goods, the conduits for Asian goods to European markets, and the economic geography of the entire Eurasian world and Nisian world, and initiated a globe-growing industry. that continues to shape human civilization today. Today, the sailors who cruise those early caravels, many of them aanit en of musses of vekreis legalized Spaniards with a Spaniard's Thors with no specialized background in
were
in a very real sense. The very real sense, the last medieval sailors and the first modern ones simultaneously, chap, x space, women in the sea, hidden lives in maritime culture. The history of medieval maritime culture has been run in of the male sailor and this rifati, thus majority the vast majority of men were men, but to reduce the relationship and the sea to the passive role of shore-bound wife or widow, or for that is it a complex reality. Women participated in the maritime world of Middle Ages in a variety of ways. Of Psum and other recovered of others recoverable only careful regiments that were not primarily designed to record their presence. The wives and families of sailors, a merchant's Morkibime in medieval cities, when a husband or father or partner devoid on several months or more the management of household finances, von Sissen. Ships. Sometimes the Iagnaziagnu finds left behind medieval commercial records from Italian cities, free world, and English such remnants of commercial agents assist some managing some agents, signing contracts, managing partnerships, and representing their households in commercial negotiations with a degree of autonomy that reflects the practicalness. It's within the withins. It's remember and make her extended periods. Some women did make sea voyages in the medieval period, though rarely as crewmers. Pilgrims of both sexes traveled by sea to the shrines of the Holy Land, Santiago de Compostela, and the Bosteola and Rome, and the accounts The accounts of medieval pilgrimage and freely include frequent and moot among their passengers. The Englishwoman Marjorie Cambay, the dear contemporary of Morris of the Mabels, is one of the most remarkable Nawabs in the least political periods. Describes Bismarck sea voyages in considerable detail, including the challenges of going with reluctant shipmasters and the experience of storm as trial. The women of medieval fishing communities are a central role in the shore-based economy, the sustained fishing industry, the cleaning, salting, the drunken loots were predominantly in Philippine communities, the wives and daughters, fishermen, managed the domestic economy. They took over the day, and in the present, an occupation and a maintenance to the survival of fishing households, being with productive seasons. The figure of the mermaid, one of the most persistent and widespread images of white Kirshner Wiggum culture. Encodes complex cultured sort women, and the sea mermaids appear in pulse, a European maritime cult term. Runestones, adults eighth, then and word often contradictory. They were associated simultaneously with beauty, danger, ins and consequence, an embodiment of the sea's ambivalent character, counteracted onto a female form. The ubiquity of the mermaid image in medieval maritime art, the Viking held, suggests that the association between sing and the sea's dangerous allure was a powerful organizing concept in the cultural imagination of medieval sailors. Sailors, even act as actual women, remained largely excluded from the working life of the ships. In chapter Inging Norseeing, the northern sailors of the northern sailors, the Viking Age, the period of his expansion, raiding, trading, and settlement from the late in loving trees. Lo thee, left a legacy in your legacy in European history that was both destructive of than the simple narrative then suggests the Norse impact on the political, commercial, cocoa, as girl, argent, map, medieval Europe is mild, virid, and land that delivered through of the sea, the medium of the sea, the settlements that North sailors, the Atlantic of Europe, Ireland, Northern England, Normandy, and the unmeant Reni, fundamentally and gourmet sins, of those regions, the Normans, Northmen, who settled in the Seine Valley in the early 10th century under the Enro, became with you a few some of the furnerations of stum nimbalithi and mintenifter administrative minivers and administrative operators in the medieval world, conquering England in 1066 and 66, and southern and Italy and Sicily in the following decades. The stalling decades that stunted the regions for centuries. The ability to move forces rapidly. Snooping by sea, sumupote in the memory. Then the memory, in the five, the maritime nuvix. Logistics, the Norse trade, that to the Atlantic and to the Mediterranean created canacrines as to the front dunes to the present dune to the present day. Norse traders operating along the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Western Dvina, the Ken, Bovolup, Kiev, Dwight, Ambade, and Angrit, and the Islamic Caliphate, and the Islamic Calvert, and the silver that slumbered that flowed northward for these nightmares from the Islamic world, as documented by the enormous hordes of Arab domes, and in Scandinavia's sites. This trade network helped create in Europe and freer in Europe and Northern Europe and the Eurasian economy, the Iranian economy, the technical legacies advised the shipped transgenerations of northern European sailors and linked Neverlingsting building tradition. Centuries. The clinker building tradition, overlapping planks,
and
queues, remain the dominant construction method in northern European shipbuilding and through the medieval period, and the skills of the Norse or shipwright were the foundation on which the naval shipbuilding of building traditions of England, Netherlands, and the Hanseatic cities were or built. The Norse genius for design, Estais expression, expressed elegance in its and nurses, direct effectiveness, the nurse, established a standard of seaports it was sought to mean improve. Improve the cultural impact of the Viking Age on the European in centuries of rudimentaries. Reconstruction. The Norse themselves were skilled nav artists. The Icelandic Sadis, the Bagayers, thus the voyages of exploration, the legal disputes of the settlement period and the settlement period, and the careers of famous Vikings are among the most sophisticated prose narratives produced in medieval Europe. And these narratives have shaped Shepskonsen's nations have understood the Norse world. The reality of Norse maritime time culture was more complex, more commercially oriented, more commercially and romantic, but at a romantic Viking mythology allows the genuine achievements of Norse seafarers, particularly the North Atlantic explosion that represented the first European contact with the Americas, deserve recognition as a more missed. Zation, Chapter Sato, the Sea in Medieval Imagination. Monsters and the unknown. The medieval ocean was not merely a physical space. It was It was also a conceptual one, a territory of the imagination in which the boundaries of the known world dissolved, and the possibilities of the unknown became both threatening and exciting. How medieval people imagined the sea, what they believed lay beyond the horizon. How they mapped the relationship between the familiar and unfamiliar as a metaphor about medieval geography. Geography. The map A Mundi. The world maps. Maps of the medieval Christian tradition. Presented in as the boundary of the known world. Ahar Anki. Connecting its parts. In the most schematic of these maps, in the world append of Rwanda, dans Europe, UK, and Europe, Asia, and Africa, by the Mediterranean Sea and the rivers Nile and Don, with the Aran, with the ocean Mediterranean, Iscaronian, is land masses. The spiritual geography of these maps placed Jerusalem at the center of the world, and Sarais, Benes, the sons of Orv of the Gull Sea and Etano Sea Rent Noi, a noise. Navigational concerns. These were not navigational charts, but possible origins. Emperor their monster-filled ocean margins, as the medieval connection it is of the known world, as well as some cultural danger. No. Danger. Sea monsters. Imbibed in the motion of the ocean. The vast size and deep opacity of the made it flavitat for creatures beyond experience and medieval not natural history. Drawing on classical sources such as Pliny's Natural History and on Bistone History Beston's and Styry tradition, populated the deep water with whales large enough to be mistaken for islands, with sea serps capable of dragging ships to the depths, with hybrid creatures that combined the familiars noise and in the eyes of the Persian publicness. Otherness, the famous legend of the island that turned out to be a whale, which appears in various literature of the miracle maritime culture. Other minor cultures from maritime cultures, from Irish monastic law to Adrics and Wietners to Arabic vivid sex. His a particularly vivid sense of how the ocean to human knowledge was processed. Form the Irish tradition of the Imrama, the voyage narrative, the most remarkable literary treatments of the sea and the medieval world, the Navigatio Sancti Brandani, the Use Ain Brandon, Budge, the Bria 7 years of an Irish monk and his companions tend to a facsimiles it to and as the end of series of fantastical islands humbling Christian islands that combine Christian allegory with what appear to be distant memories as of actual North Atlantic phenomenon. The island that burns on its surface, interpreted by scholars as a possible reference to an active volcanic island, the column of the sea. The column of crystal in the sea, perhaps a recollection of an iceberg. The dense fog that surrounds certain regions of the ocean. All these episodes seem to encode genuine Atlantic navigational experience within a framework of spiritual quest narrative, the gradual filling in of the unknown on medieval maps. The process by way which the monster inhabited in an world of the world with knowing something slack and exploration proceeded was one of the most consequential intellectual developments of the later medieval and early modern periods. The portolan charts of the Mediterranean, the accounts of travelers, Marco Polo, Ixnid, Paulated, Bixion, Edu, and Atiach, and eventually charts compiled included words givers of the world's geography that was simultaneously more accurate and more challenging to the moapnaphical thought. The ocean that had been boundary became it reaccumulated experience of medieval sailors as a highway, and the world on the other side of was far larger, far stranger, and far more interesting than the middle imagination had allowed. Chapter the end of the medieval sea. The medieval sea toward the age of discovery, the transition from the medieval maritime world to the age of discovery was not a sudden rupture, but gradual inculcation and accumulated knowledge in accumulated knowledge, and the bull Hupham and Diagonati Magnatizarity of Metashow Seafaring a Breastlet, a pride to be stressed, it's not breastfield of projects. The sailors and ships set sail and the oceanic routes of the 15th and 16th centuries direct areas mere and strike naminum evil of many and spread Bonestein Mendes battled by inbanking age and beyond, and understand continuities between the medieval and early modern world is as important as appreciating what only knew. The improvements, the Minge design that made long Oshi X practical, en oceanic OLE esivedio tiarjolpren o evolution. Evolution. The full-rigged ship. Kimpomani squares. Kanos mesi amenaces that became the standard vessel of the age of discovery, was a synthesis of the northern European Euro-rig square rig tradition and the Mediterranean Latine tradition, both of which roots. The caravel was developed from Miberian Fim Basin Redisons. Adarhifus and Methagage Methas and Spenas explorers used the magnetic compass, the mirror limbs, oti, mirrors astrolabe, latitude sailing, were all medieval developments applied new geographical contexts. The institutional and commercial organizations that funded it and organized that spogazed in their origins. The Portuguese Vanscan Transflorencement drew in commercial and commercials and followed on commercial models developed during the Artiate, the Ganzexit Egg, and the Hanseatic League. The concept of commercial age voyage organized by a merchant commerçant and ten costs his citizens and prefect wizards planned a new geographical gabe on a new geographic scale. The legal and diplomatic frameworks, the politics in Muscovy were true democratic institution. Diplomatic institutions. What was genuinely new about the age of discovery was the scale of above the bonds of will move. The willingness to venture beyond the ethnic into the deep ocean. Deep soon cruelly deluded as and navigavacy to reach Asia by sea. This ambition was itself in goth speculation. Including both and the levigitionist tradition ad mass myrtles that had motives that it with unknown Asian soon with smarvers. Mercib and the medieval tradition of fantastic voyage narratives that had populated the ocean with marvels. The sailors who first crossed the Atlantic get by of rigs of royal patronage, real patronage, genuine caribbeers about what lay beyond the horizon, and beyond the horizon, and the residual medieval conviction, that the ocean fiction, that the ocean concealed wonders worth the risk of finding. The age of discovery that the medieval maritime world transformed the planet, that are still unfolding, connecting conveniences and the seas. If the Armansons, the new sequences demographic, ecological, cultural, and economic of overwhelming scale. But that transformation was built on the nation, and that sounded in that sailors had laid acquisiting 6 centuries. The accumulated practical, no wind, current and hull design, the commercial networks, it gave commerce its economic logic, the navigational, them that made it possible to find way across a row in return to end imminently, leave the land, come myself to the sea. Of the sea, every ship rounded it. Man, his serves the renewal of man, his small yet vadens of his small wooden vessel, reading the sky and the water, sailing on,